The computer market is in crisis. AI data centers are buying up all the memory, causing prices to skyrocket. Which is why, more than ever, it's important to investigate how cheaply you can buy a PC that can run CS2. I covered the N100 recently, being a £100 MiniPC that I said could run CS2, but you wouldn't want to run on it because it was a sub 40 FPS lagfest. So we need more than that. Plus, now the price of these mini PCs has more than doubled to over £200 thanks to the rush on RAM and stuff. So let's move on up to the Steam Deck. The cheapest version of this thing cost £350 back in July, but now, with the world in crisis, it costs £350. It's like a small miracle. But how does it handle CS2? Well, I didn't even attempt the Steam Deck's built-in controls, but rather tried using it like this. When playing in this way, I felt myself naturally gravitating towards viewing the screen at a 45-degree angle, with the keyboard further away from me than the screen was, and it just wasn't optimal. So then I hooked it up to a gaming monitor to see how it fared if used like a standard desktop PC. I've tested Counter-Strike 2 on this device several times over the years, and it has improved. But it is a hassle. All of its built-in components, like its on-screen keyboard, pops up when you least expect it, and its onboard screen makes it a hassle to get working with any external screens you might also have plugged in. But switching to desktop mode, and after a bit of dabbling and adjusting the screen setup, I got CS2 working on my external gaming monitor at 120Hz. It ran at about 60 to 70 FPS in deathmatch mode, with responsiveness varying between quite good and a bit laggy. Occasionally my character's view model would go black. This used to be a much more prominent issue in this game on the Steam Deck, where large swathes of the map would be plunged into darkness. But in its current state, it's nothing more than a minor, albeit irritating, kind of bug. I played a deathmatch game on the device and I have to say was pleasantly surprised by how it performed. If it were any other game, I'd say its performance was okay. It's just a bit inconsistent with how it would respond to my mouse movements. At some points it would feel like it was trailing behind my inputs by a few frames a second, but at other times it felt perfectly responsive despite the frame rate it was operating at, and I was able to nail some pretty nifty reflex-based shots. But since this is such a highly competitive Twitch shooter where dying kind of sucks, I would not want to play CS2 on this device, which I would class as having borderline performance in this title. Get something better. So we'll say goodbye to portable solutions and hello to large, bulky, custom-built desktop PCs instead. I'll tell you the secret to building a cheap desktop PC right now. It's to use DDR4 RAM. The newer DDR5 sort is being sold out all over the place. And while DDR4 has also risen in price, it hasn't done so by anywhere near as much. Unfortunately, opting for the older, slower sort of RAM isn't the massive compromise you might think it is for building a budget rig, because many of the best budget processors also happen to be compatible with DDR4. Here's a handy little guide to how they should all run CS2. These ones in bronze will run the game, but with compromises. For instance, some of the older AMD and Intel processors in this category don't even support Windows 11. So do your research if you're going to go for these. Please don't go for these. The ones I've coloured in silver should already be able to run Counter-Strike 2 brilliantly, and with the exception of this one, can all be upgraded to significantly better processors at a later date, should you wish to. Processors like these gold options, which I'd consider to be excellent processors, but at prices that are wandering beyond the realm of ultra budget. Like with a lot of this video, I had to do a huge amount of work for what doesn't appear to be much. For instance, I actually went out and bought a Ryzen 4-500 for science, then had to go through the rigmarole of fitting it. I swear, PCs should be more like Lego. Just slot something in and then you're done. But instead it's more like you have to pry metal wiring off serrated heatsink edges, apply thermal paste which always gets everywhere, push down hard on the motherboard and risk breaking it, and I did all of this for these figures. Just to confirm that yes, the Intel 12100 and Ryzen 4-500 can both run CS2, and at almost exactly the same speeds. I was honestly expecting the Intel one to be significantly faster, but oh well. They both managed well over 100 FPS most of the time on a busy Dust 2 deathmatch server, with occasional dips down to maybe about 90 FPS. Ignore what people say, the experience with these was very good. But of course, you should aspire to buy something as high up this list as possible. But I bestow the ultra budget honour to the Ryzen 4-500 and Intel 12100F processors, which at just £60 or £70 are already so cheap that there really is no point in going even cheaper. But ideally, you should spend a bit more and get the Ryzen 5-500 instead, which is a big jump up. Or even better, spend quite a bit more and get either the Ryzen 5-600 or Intel 12400F, which are like the no compromise versions of these ultra budget options. And even these can be upgraded further at a later date if you need even more performance. You really should be considering future upgrade paths when buying a budget build today. With the AM4 platform, you can go all the way up to processors like the Ryzen 5700X3D, which as you can see here is a huge upgrade. I was honestly surprised by how good it was. However, AMD have discontinued making these, they're widely sold out and are wildly inflated in price, so I think these days the Intel platform has more upgrade potential. Get an LGA 1700 motherboard today and you should quite easily be able to slot in a 13600 or 14600K into it later on, as there are loads of these going about and they already sell for less than £200. At this point they're not even great budget picks, they're just great all-round processors. Aside from possibly the processor, the graphics card is the most important decision you have to make, and fortunately now is about the best time there's been for buying one of these things. There is just so much choice in the second-hand market. I attempted a summary here. Problem is, there are so many options to choose from so many different eras, from so many different companies, and so many weird ones that don't quite fit in with the rest of the naming scheme, like the RTX 3050 or Radeon 6500 XT. I didn't even know where to put the Vega cards, but put it simply, unless you're on a mega stingy ultra budget, there's no point in getting something that isn't in the great category here. I feel very confidently about these cards because I know they'll all be able to run this game really well. A second-hand RTX 2060, for instance, is one of the cheapest and slowest cards in this category. I tested it myself and I can vouch for it being excellent in CS2, and it shouldn't cost much more than £100, so try to find one of those. I'll just show you the benchmarks I did, ranked from fastest to slowest. All of these delivered smooth, totally playable performances, though I'd argue that only the GeForce 970 and above delivered flawless experiences in this game. And remember, this was using low preset at 1080p, which looks like this. It's not even proper 1080p because it's using FSR upscaling. So if you want to use higher graphics options and graphics settings with prettier visuals, then I'd ideally opt for something with a bit more headroom. It really doesn't cost that much, and there are so many cards all priced so similarly that you can significantly improve the card you get by spending an extra £20 or so. I was somewhat limited to what I could buy in the local CEX shop. The GeForce 970, for instance, was £45. There's a nice bunch of cards all for around the same sort of performance, like the GeForce 970, 1060, Radeon 480 and 580s, and you can get these in 6 and 8GB variants for £75 or even less. I'd start your ultra budget card hunting there. All of these cards though are heading up to being about 10 years old at this point, so paying more isn't just going to get you more performance, but also a card that's had fewer years of wear and tear. But if you want new, you won't be able to get such great value for money. Even the cheapest of the new AMD and Nvidia offerings, like the 9060 and RTX 5050, are overkill for CS2 and will cost upwards of £200. Don't get me wrong, they're great for running CS2 on, it's just you don't need this much. So you could try to save a bit of money by opting for the cheaper RTX 3050 or Intel B570 instead. But honestly, if you're going to look at one of these, then you might as well go a bit further and buy the aforementioned 9060 or 5050 instead, because they're much better. I tested one Intel graphics card, being the Intel B580. I really want to like this card. It's got great specs for a very reasonable price, but in CS2 I was disappointed with its performance. Don't get me wrong, it ran the game just fine. I even reran it at highest preset just to prove that point, because just because its frame rate on low settings isn't sky high, it doesn't mean it's struggling to run the game. Very high preset in CS2 helped this card to stretch its legs, and while it did perform marginally slower than low preset did, it still performed very smoothly. It's just that its frame rate underperformed how it should have done. This is a £200 graphics card being outperformed by a £45 GeForce 970 in Counter-Strike 2. I think this is because Intel are newer to the market, their drivers less polished, and this gets me onto the other thing to consider, because with graphics cards it's not all about the frame rates, it's also about the lag reducing features. A lot of newer AMD and Nvidia cards now have anti-lag or reflex support in this game, which can make the game feel more responsive than its frame rate might suggest. And Intel cards do not currently have that in this game. They have the feature, it's called XL, but CS2 doesn't support that. So it's a double whammy. Intel's frame rates in Counter-Strike are lower, and they don't feel as responsive as other cards would at those same frame rates. I wouldn't get the Radeon 380 even for an ultra budget build because its drivers are already 5 years out of date, and it's old and it doesn't support anti-lag. And the Radeon 6500 XT, despite many concerns about its performance, actually ran CS2 amazingly well. It also supported anti-lag, but I'd still rather go for the slightly more expensive Radeon 6600 just in case, given the number of dangerously flawed bottlenecks in the 6500 XT graphics card, even if it didn't hinder its performance in this testing. How much RAM do you need? I need more apparently, as my testing was a complete shambles. You'd think with all these sticks of RAMs lying about, I'd be able to find a working pair of RAM to test 16GB with. I did have an earlier version of this script where I argued that RAM is so cheap you might as well get 32GB and be done with it. But that's not the case anymore, is it? So instead I've had to test all sorts of weird combinations of 4GB sticks and 16GB sticks to try and cover the whole lot. Now you should never only have one stick of RAM in your system, since it halves the bandwidth and you don't get such good performance, apparently. We'll see. So here are my results. All tests were conducted on Dust2 Deathmatch online. I tested my 32GB set at a slow 2666 MHz, then at its optimal config at 3600 MHz. And you can see how much of a difference the speed makes. A 13% improvement to the averages, and a 24% improvement to the 1% lows. So on your PC right now, go into the BIOS and just make sure your RAM is operating at optimal speeds. It does make a difference. I then had two pleasant surprises with my RAM testing. The first was when I tested with just 8GB of RAM, and it actually performed perfectly well. I was expecting performance to drop off, for the 1% lows to be terrible and so on, yet it performed more or less on par with the slower 32GB set of RAM that I tested. That's brilliant news given the insane prices for RAM right now. Would I trust just 8GB of RAM in CS2? Well, I'd rather have 16, but 8 worked just fine in my testing. Although I now have a video covering 8GB in CS2 more thoroughly, and there are a few rare instances where it would decrease performance. To learn more, click on that thing that's in the top right corner of this video to go to my other video on this topic. And the second pleasant surprise I had was when I tested just one stick of RAM in order to test just 16, and it performed just as well as the 2 sticks of RAM had done. How about that? In conclusion, minimum spec of RAM for a CS2 rig is 8GB, but 16 would be more comfy. And you might be able to get away with buying just one stick of RAM now and another later on. But don't hate me if it goes wrong. So with all this testing in mind, it's time to suggest some builds. This is a setup I configured on Partpicker, link in the description. We'll start with a no compromise build. The latest AM5 platform, 16GB of DDR4 RAM, a modern graphics card, and it costs £740. This is probably what you'd end up with if you kept going, oh, what if I get a slightly better processor or slightly better graphics card? So it's a sort of sweet spot. And yes, it will run CS2 extremely well, but no, you don't need to spend anywhere near as much as this. And yes, the processors come with their own coolers, but if you really want to, you can spend more and get a better one instead. I'm not going to though. No, I'm going low. My next build cuts the price to £604 by opting for last generation processor, motherboard and RAM instead, and it will still be bitchingly fast in CS2. But we can go lower still. £490 by compromising the processor by opting for a Ryzen 5 500 instead. It is still a pretty decent 6-core processor, which for £79 is a bargain. The GeForce 3050 is considered a rip-off, but it's about as cheap as you can get for a new graphics card. It's great for CS2, and for this price new, it's either that or the Radeon 6 500 XT. Take your pick. There's definitely value to being able to buy all these components new, away from the unpredictable nature of the second-hand market. But without much effort and a few second-hand purchases, I managed this for just £320. The pricing changes every day. The GeForce 970 is ancient, but it still supports reflex to make the frames feel more responsive, which is awesome to have. And CEX, the shop I bought it from, bundled it with a 5-year warranty, so I have a bit of peace of mind there as well. The Ryzen 4 500 comes with its own cooler, which I think is probably enough for something of its power, and I opted for just one stick of 8GB of RAM, although it is fast. There was probably a time a few months ago when you could have got 16GB for the same price, but here we are. Now I'm not saying you should get a build with just one stick of 8GB of RAM, but at least if you do, you can slot in another if you're struggling. Because something feels wrong about spending more on RAM than on the CPU or GPU. It makes me think Valve should definitely sell the Steam Machine in a variant without RAM or a storage device at all, for people who probably have older setups where they can just use the RAM and storage from that. Or maybe just to sell the machine with just one stick of 8GB to keep the price as low as possible for esports builds. But failing that, there's always this. CS2 is playable on a budget.